Okay, so HTMX. Show of hands then, before we start. Who here has used the AJAX system in Drupal? Who likes the AJAX system in Drupal? Yeah, there we are. Has anyone used like the more advanced features, like the AJAX commands interface and things? Yeah, the sort of thing that I'd use and go, that's interesting, I'm never touching that again. Yeah, okay.
Working once, never touch again.
So, why am I talking about HTMX? So, I'll come to that in a sec. So, I'm Phil Norton, a developer at Code Enigma, involved with Drupal for goodness knows how long, 20 years there. But and I run Hashbang Code, where I write a lot of stuff about Drupal and all kinds of things. There's a bit of code in this, so I've got 2 demos, which should work quite nicely. But if you go to that link, that should be the slides, and there should be links to all the resources here. So don't worry about catching up or anything, because it's all available online, and you can always talk to me afterwards. So HTMX in Drupal. So HTMX is currently in Drupal. It was added in 11.3 as a core component, and is the new standard for AJAX requests. So that means that all existing AJAX features need to be rewritten in HTMX, but we'll come on to that. So it doesn't make sense to me to introduce this system without actually talking about HTMX in the first place. So the first part of this talk really is an introduction to HTMX and what it is and how it works. And then we'll look at how that system is integrated into Drupal. So HTMX then is a JavaScript framework fundamentally. It's just, that's what it is. So it allows AJAX calls and some CSS transitions without writing JavaScript code. So that's fundamental. You don't need to write JavaScript to write HTMX stuff. It's quite small and has no dependencies or other requirements at all. So it's just a single file. And by platform agnostic, I mean it's written with the browser in mind, but it doesn't care what's behind it. So you can interface it with PHP or Go or Python or anything you want behind the scenes. But essentially, it's run through HTML attributes. So you know where you got your A tag in href, where you need to add more to make HTMX work. And any element on the page can issue a web request to this AJAX interface. And all responses fundamentally should be in plain HTML. So there's none of this weird proprietary JSON format stuff going on. It's all just HTML responses. So to install HTMX, it's not complicated. Just include the file. There are CDN options available, so you can drop that in if you like. But we're now ready to go. HTML attributes are either prefixed with HX or data HX. I have to say that Drupal has chosen the data HX one, but they're both interchangeable inside the library, so it doesn't matter which one you go for. There's about 11 attributes commonly used and about 20 or 30 that add more stuff, but generally you'll focus on about 5 core attributes. So for example, here we've got a button with hxget. So hxget means we're going to make a get request to this index.php file, and because it's a button, it's triggered when the button is clicked. So it sort of automatically detects it's a button and will add the trigger element to that. And the target of the response is then this div1. So div1 is where the response will come from. It will go into inside the page. So the request we make to the server will be tagged with this hx request header, so we can sort of detect that on the back end. You can add certain attributes to make more headers, but generally you don't need that if you're starting off. So when we respond to the request, we respond in plain HTML. So if we respond with a p tag with button clicked inside it, then our div would end up looking like this with button clicked in it. And then, so To create this stuff in the backend, I've created this little HTMX class, and this HTMX request thing is how PHP sees the header. So it's just a way of detecting that it's a HTMX request, and we can say it's a GET request with this GET request method server attribute. But I've written this as a kind of wrapper around interfacing the backend, which basically means I can simplify things. So we detect the HTMX request header coming in, and if it's a GET request, and respond with something like this. So this just makes it more dynamic. So we're printing off the date. So when the user clicks the button, we print off the date and return that as a response. Right, that was it really. So. So it doesn't get much more complicated than that. The more common attributes change the way that this interaction works. So you can change the verbs. So we've seen get, but we can have post, delete, patch, and put. So you can respond to services in different ways. All good there. The target is the target element we swapped, obviously. So give this is a CSS selector, so you can just give it any element on the page that it will be swapped into. We can also stipulate triggers. So button obviously gets an automatic click event because it's a clickable element. Same thing with AJAX and stuff. Some of the form elements get like select and change triggers by automatic. You can add a trigger though to any HTML attribute. So this makes a div tag a clickable element. Not necessarily the best thing in the world for accessibility, but you can do that. But we can do this in a variety of ways. So we can make, obviously we've got click, we can do click and augment it with a once. So the user clicks on it and we can't run that again because it's a single use trigger. Load is probably more useful for a div tag. So when the page is loaded, we load things onto the page using the HTMX attributes. But we can also a comma separate those things, so we can have a click event as well. Revealed is probably more useful. So it's the same thing as load, but when the element is pushed into the what's it called, the viewpoint of the browser, you then start doing stuff where it triggers that event. So rather than automatically loading things when the browser loads, it loads things when it's revealed into the viewport. Viewport's the right word. And then we can load and augment that with a delay. So that delay 500 milliseconds just says wait for a minute before we load this. And then the last one is input method. So obviously this gets a few free triggers because it's a form element. But we can say when the user releases the key, then delay a call for 1 second before they do that. HTMX understands debouncing as well, so it won't trigger lots of events. It'll just trigger the last thing that happened. So you don't get lots of repeated triggers. HS select is another one of these elements, and this is where Drupal is kind of required with the HX select. So we send a request, we get a response, and HX select allows us to pick from that response what we want to put into our page. So we've said ID of response here, which means that anything with the ID of response in the page will get picked up and put into our div tag. The secondary P there won't get displayed at all, it will just get thrown away. So this is fundamental in Drupal because when you ask for a HTMX page in Drupal, you get a big page with the body tags and everything in it, and sometimes with a menu system as well. So you need to pick out from that request the stuff you want to actually display, which is especially important with forms because when you ask Drupal for a HTMX form, you get the entire form back. So you need to pick out from the form the elements that you want to replace in the page. So HS select you'll probably use quite a lot in Drupal land. Outer band is also kind of an interesting mechanism. So outer band means it's like a concept of it's not necessarily connected to the thing that user is interacting with at the moment. But what we're going to do here is two things. So we're doing request sent gets replaced with send request, so the text of the button gets changed. And a secondary action is that we pick up the ID of div1 and we're putting it into the div1 with ID there. So we're actually doing two things on the page there. We can extend that by doing lots of things on the page. So we can ask the server for multiple different IDs, and we get back all those IDs, and we start populating the page with different bits, which is quite useful, I think. So this is HS swap as well, which governs how you change the elements on the page. So just so far we've seen inner HTML, which means that everything you add in will be injected inside the tags you want. Outer HTML obviously replaces the whole thing, so you can replace buttons, replace div tags. Inner HTML is default, yeah. There's text content if you want to not pass the HTML coming out, which gives some interesting effects. You can also do things like for begin and after begin things to put the response inside the DOM in different places, which is useful. I've got an example of this in a minute. You can delete the element or do nothing at all, but still respond to out-of-band items as well. So none is kind of useful if you want to keep the button intact and not do anything with it, but have it do other things on the page. There's also a concept of swap out-of-bands, which is kind of similar to select out-of-band, but in this case it's the response telling the page what to swap inside the context of the page. So the button here has no concept of what a div1 is, but the response comes back with div1 and says HS swap equals true, or out-of-bands equals true. What that does is then it populates the page with responses from the server. So in this way we can issue a request in a sort of dumb fashion from the page, get back a response and start populating the page with information, which I think is really useful. Quick note on CSS transitions. So as HTMX does all this stuff on the page, it adds classes, and those classes can be used to animate things that are happening on the page. So this CSS transition property here, so we've got a p tag inside a div, and the class of HTMX added makes that element invisible, but because it's got a higher specificity, it gets that as the element's added onto the page. Once it's finished adding to the page, HTMX will remove that class, which means that the opacity would be set to 1, but because we've got that transition there, it means that we're animating that change. So rather than just popping stuff onto the page, we can then slowly introduce it without startling the user, I guess. I've got a demo of this in a second that I'll try to show, but just quickly, there's lots of stuff about configuring HTMX, and you can change how swap style works by default using out HTML by changing the swap style here. By the way, this changes everything about what HTMX does, so be careful with it, but I thought I'd tell you about this anyway. Quick demo then, we should be here. So I've got my HTMX class on the right, which shows just the thing I was looking at before, although it's a bit longer because I've added loads of other stuff to kind of listen to requests. And this is fully available online, so you can download this and play with it. But I've got a simple GET request here. So I click the button, I get the response, and it's just plain HTML, and that's added into the page in the div tag. We can do a CSS transition, which is exactly the code I was just showing a minute ago. By the way, all these examples have some text that explains what's going on as well, so I thought that might be useful as well. And we can do more complicated things. So I've got an infinite scroll here. So if I look at the elements on the page, I've got a reveal once trigger on this last p tag. So I'm printing off 9 p tags, and then the last one I'm saying, when this is revealed onto the page, go and fetch the next page of results from this list, and put that after the end of this element, so it puts it underneath the this p tag. So if I scroll down and bring that into view, it'll populate the page. And the critical thing is the response also contains that same trigger tag. So we can just keep on going. This will never get to the end, so I won't bore you with that. Slightly more complicated is I've got a comment form here. So this is kind of an interesting situation where as the page loads, it loads the available comments and puts them into a thing, into a list, and adds a button to the bottom so I can click on it and get a form back. But that form is generated by HTMX response, so it just submits the form, it brings back the form again. So if I type in my comment, oops, that's perfect. What that does is it sends off to the server a post request, and the response is my comment plus the button to add another comment in. So there's actually two files in there involved with loading the comments and saving the comments, but and it just stores them in a CSV file behind the scenes. So not particularly interesting, but it shows through a couple of endpoints and a couple of triggers I can do quite complicated things. Over time. You show a progress bar, so this does the same thing, but in this case we're just increasing the width element of that page using, if I look at the element, I don't think I can get it in there quick enough. You see every 600 seconds, so I'm polling a request every 600 milliseconds to get a response back from the server, and that just increases the amount of width that element has. And then when it's finished, it gets another response, which changes the request to another job.
Just to clarify, these are standalone PHP, not Drupal.
This is standalone PHP, yeah. I'll come into Drupal now, actually. Yeah. HTMX and Drupal, right. So now that we've done all that, so HTMX is added to Drupal as a library, so you can introduce a library. But there's a few classes to sort of assist in adding this to the requests, and adding this to the page and responding to requests. So yeah, as a standard, as I mentioned before, Drupal has this data HX thing, so that's how tags are produced in Drupal. It does exactly the same as the other one, but it's just a different way of doing it. So there's actually two libraries in Drupal. So there's the core HTMX thing, which is just the HTMX file, but they've also added a Drupal.htmx library. I have to say, you rarely need to directly include these libraries. They will be included through your actions of trying to do HTMX stuff. But the additional scripts are quite useful. So let's say, HTMX assets, for example, let's say you render a node on the back end and send it to the front end. That node might contain, some CSS rules on its own, and you want those to be on the page as well. So because Drupal responds with an entire page with the HTML and body tags in, it also includes the CSS files in the top of that request or response, and the assets is then used to pick up those CSS files and put them in your current page, so you can then render stuff properly, which is really clever. Which means that I can like print off anything I want in the back end, throw it at the front end, and it just displays it as if it was rendered on the front end in the first place. So HTMX behaviors integrates with the behavior system. So if you've got any custom JavaScript, it'll still work with HTMX in the same way that it would before. And then HTMX utils is just a couple of helper things to help as classes, just some functions. So generally, you'll probably be using this HTMX class, which is part of the core infrastructure as a wrapper around things. And you can also get it to inject headers and things for responding to HTMX. This HTMX request info trait is also used as a way of detecting incoming requests that might be HTMX. So for example, we use the HTMX class like this. So we create some render array. So this one just creates a p tag. And then we pass it into the apply to method of the HTMX class. So we make a new object and apply these attributes in. And what that does is on the right hand side, so that's what we get on the front end. It sort of adds these things and translates these methods into attributes. The key thing is the apply to will also add the HTMX library to your page request. So it's already there as part of the page request anyway. You might see it written like this. This is just alternative syntax in PHP 8.3, I think. But basically, this is the same sort of thing as that. You're creating a new object and you're using that to populate parameters in the same way. So the response, you can respond to HTMX using this HTMX renderer. Again, you probably won't have to interface with this service directly, but it renders a little HTMX document, or HTML document rather, and sends it upstream, and takes care of some of the CSS and JavaScript interpretation as well. But if you want Drupal to respond with that payload, there's two ways to do it. You can use this wrapper format equals Drupal HTMX. So in your request back to the instance, you give this header, give this page parameter, and it will respond back with HTMX. Or in your roots, you can have HTMX root equals true, and that'll be a HTMX root that will only respond with this sort of flat file stuff. So plug this into controllers then. So think about your approach with controllers. So you can either have one root which can respond with two different ways. So you can have logic that represents the page, and then logic that represents the HTMX elements in that page. Or you can have two roots where you've got your rendering page, and then everything else that HTMX happens behind the scenes. A bit code to this one, but if you're going to use the HTMX request info trait in the controller, you need to inject the request stack service into that controller. And you also need to have a method called getRequest, because it sort of expects those things to be there. But that's about that. I'll let you take a picture. But once it's in the class, you can do things like this. So you can say this is an HTMX request and do things like that. So this is an example of a single action that will have multiple different things going on in it. And then your HTMX root looks a bit like this. So this is what you would do for the second method, where you've got two different roots doing different things with the page. I do have a demo of the stuff, so just hold on a minute. So with forms then, it works in very much the same way as controllers, but you need to decorate the elements inside your build form. So when you're building out your form, you would inject the form elements into the apply to method of your HTMX class. But there's no need to create all these callback functions and things. It's simplified AJAX forms quite a lot. So yeah, we'll come into that in a sec. But you would do this kind of thing. So this is a text element, and we're decorating that with HTMX. And this archaic looking regex looking stuff, what that'll do is it'll say, look up for the element on the page that has the name tag, or the name text, sorry. But it looks for the parent of that. So rather than replacing only the attribute itself or the input tag itself, we're replacing everything surrounding it. This is taken from Drupal core, by the way. They do this inside Drupal core. But we're looking for a keyword delay of 1 second, and we're applying it to this text area. So rather than just replacing the input tag, we're replacing everything to do with that element. And request info trait is part of the form base as well, so we don't need to specially include that. We just get it for free. So you can, at the top of your build form, you can do stuff with the HTMX request, and then build the rest of the form. But fundamentally, when you think about how forms are built in Drupal, you have to respond with have to think about the form as a whole. You can't inject elements and expect them to be there because they need to be in place after the build step. If you look at the process of submitting a form, Drupal builds the form and then it submits the form. So if the elements aren't in the build handler, they won't be part of your submit request, and you can't then do things with them. So forms have to be consistent. In other words, you can't just throw stuff at it and expect it to work. So a demo. Right. Yeah, right. So I've got a Drupal module here with a few different things going on. I've got infinite scroll in Drupal land, which I've printed off on the right here. Can you see that okay? Yeah. So this is me creating a paragraph tag, and then because I would need to include this wrapper format thing, I need to create the roots. If you leave the get on its own, it'll assume you're looking at the current page, if that makes sense. But because I needed to give it these options, I've had to create this root here. And then, yeah, just applying it to the paragraph. So basically, as I enter the page, if it is an HTMX request, I look at the page counter and increment that. If it's not, I start from page 1. So if I come across here, yeah, we're already creating requests. You can see here I've got page 3 here, but the response isn't just the p tags; it's everything associated with that. So I've got a header and a footer and things. So you need to be careful about what gets picked up out of that page. But yeah, this will come forever, so I'm not going to do that. I've also done it with nodes. So most of this class is about fetching stuff from the database, but I can scroll down on this page because I've filled it full of devel generate content. I'm just going to keep on going and going. But this is fairly easy. So what I'm doing here is kind of cheating. So I've got this div tag that's sat at the bottom of my node list, and as that comes into the page view, so revealed, I'm using outer HTML to swap that div tag with the next load of elements from the node rendering process, but also including another div tag at the bottom of those nodes, so I can do this again in the next request. I'm not going to go fishing for it because it's kind of hard to find the node, the ID, sorry, the div in the page, but you get the idea. I can keep on going for a long time. And then we can do something with forms. So this is an email validation form. So if I just press on that, it'll go off and validate the email address and then come back and say this email is not valid. And the request, you can see here for forms, the response is actually quite a lot of stuff. Because I'm logged in, I'm also getting all of the menu items and things. So it's really important to have your select to pick out what you need from that page request. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here. But what I'm doing is I'm going back to the server, and if it's HTMX request, I'm validating the email address, and then just using the description, I'm payloading into the description my error message and adding a class of error to that response. And then in the HTMX bit, I'm saying, yeah, if the user's typing, put a delay of a second on, and issue a request to this form. So post being empty means it'll just go to this form, and the response should then be interpreted like that. So if I put an email address like thing, it'll validate correctly and come back with nothing. But the point is that I'm using this special syntax here to replace everything that is inside that div, that element. So this whole section here will be replaced as part of that incoming request. If I black this out again, so it changes everything inside that element. else should we look at? So I want to do something useful with this. So what I've done here is a little form, and I can ask it for a node ID, and it will render it behind the scenes using that view mode and return it to the page in this view. So I can figure out what stuff looks like in particular view modes for particular nodes. I've made there's a full content here, and I've made a card, which is a different view mode. But the point is that those get rendered and returned to us. Potentially with some CSS files. So those CSS files are then picked up from the response and popped into the page header, which means it doesn't matter what kind of things I'm representing in the back end, they'll still get printed out perfectly fine in the front end. Which I thought was good. So, last little bit then. Now that I've shown all this off, there's one form in Drupal that has these elements built into it, and that's the configuration select form. So when you go into the backend and get your configuration out as a single item, it uses HTMX to generate that form. So there's a lot more to be done, obviously, to replace all this stuff. So the AJAX subsystem will be probably living in dual land for a few versions of Drupal, I would expect. But there's this initiative to replace this system with HTMX going forwards. I should mention HTMX module. So this was kind of a playground for where HTMX was introduced to Drupal, and has a few extra tools and examples of how to use HTMX in a Drupal context, including HTMX debugger and things. So kind of useful in its own right at the moment, to sort of get into practice. But if you want some resources, then there's the HTMX group on Drupal Slack. HTMX org is where HTMX project is held, so that's got the HTMX documentation, which is actually quite good for the most part. And HTMX Labs is kind of this love letter to HTMX, which is like an open source site which just runs some more examples and documentation and things. So it's quite cool. Any questions? Lots of them. You can catch me afterwards, definitely.
Sorry to be the devil's advocate here, because I am reading an article on HTMX.org, and it's entitled HTMX Sucks.
Right.
And it goes through the code scrap, no building tools, no TypeScript, antiquated technology, no components, no front and back end split, and so on and so on. So this is the first time I've heard about HTMX. So, and I texted my front-end guy and asked him about it. This is what he sent me back.
Right.
So we definitely have. My question is, we definitely have different opinions on what's going on.
Right.
So why the move? Why the decision? If this is so controversial.
I think because the AJAX system at the moment is baked into part of jQuery as well, so it uses jQuery to build itself. But all those things you mentioned, like no build tools, like great, I hate build tools. Probably the worst thing on the internet. There's no TypeScript, which is fine because I have never used TypeScript, and I don't. This doesn't need TypeScript. It doesn't tie you into a technology that's owned by Microsoft as well. And it's a more simpler approach to doing this kind of thing. So maybe we're approaching it from different angles, but I see this as a step forward in simplifying Drupal and the AJAX system, because for a long time I think I've always battled with AJAX requests. I've come along to a form and gone, right, I need to do an AJAX request. I'm going to spend an afternoon doing this, and I'm going to hate it. I've built all these examples in a couple of hours, and I think that really shows the power of this system in simplifying this model. Go on.
But it is tying together the backend developer with the front-end developer. So it's moving some of the stuff that the front-end developer was doing themselves, and it's putting more work on, inputs definitely on the backend developer now.
Yes, but the responses back from Drupal are just plain HTML. So there's nothing to stop you swapping out a library that does the same thing but with different attributes that uses that HTML. So when, as I said at the start, it's not using any weird proprietary like JSON formats or anything. We don't have to adopt another API. It's just HTML, and that's fundamental to what HTMX is doing. If you look at the sort of hypermedia stuff, it's just using HTML. Like the core is use HTML and the tools involved with HTML. Don't try and reinvent the wheel and do other things. Just use the web as it is and try to do things with that.
I think that lab's website might be quite deliberately trying to embrace irony. So a lot of comments are deliberately negative, saying, "Oh no, there's no TypeScript. Oh no, there's no." And so then, as you say, it might be quite deliberate.
Yeah.
But I see your point. Yeah.
There's not a general question. I haven't researched, so I'm not, either for or against. I'm just, because like I said, I ask my guy all the questions that I don't understand, and he comes back and he says, "This is crap, you should never use this."
I'm very much a pragmatist, so I see tools in how they're useful and how I can build them into my workflows.
The problem you're saying is not related to HTMX, it's probably related to Drupal. It's like Drupal, if you think as a front and back end thing, right? HTMX is not using anything. That if you have a component library or a design system, and that you're building, your front end developer is building that design system, it should work with the HTMX as well. Like what you showed with the node, right? Like if you have a template that's rendering your node, you're just rendering differently. Like you're rendering on an in-page. But the design of the node is already done by the front end developer, right?
Yeah, if anything, this should speed up workflows because you can build these tools using plain HTML in the front end and then just port them into Drupal in 10 minutes, rather than the other way where you wouldn't bother doing the front end because you'd spend a lot of time doing it in the back end and figuring out the AJAX requests anyway. And all you need to do for now is just is convert some libraries and things.
Yeah, I would say that the fact it doesn't need build tools is beautiful and wonderful. It makes me so happy because front-end development has become so obsessed with build tools and 10 million libraries that it needs. Anyway, that wasn't my point. I was going to ask actually about, have you experimented, I suppose maybe, I've used the AJAX system quite a bit, and obviously unless you intentionally announce to like assistive technology that something has changed on page or you change the tab position, there's not like an immediate kind of update of like, oh, there's a new thing here.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the HTMX in any way makes that easier or harder or like solves that problem better anyway. I don't know, like maybe you haven't experimented with that at all, but I'm just genuinely curious from what you've done so far with HTMX.
I have to say none of these examples are accessible. So,
yeah.
but fundamentally, it's if you have your area tags in your front end markup and your back end markup, you can announce things happening on the page quite easily.
Yeah. So if it returns some front end like area tags and things that would, in theory, those would then get picked up and be announced, or
yes,
or you could use the augmented behavior system or something. So.
Yeah.
Well, it's just returning HTML, isn't it?
Yeah.
That can contain it.
Yeah.
We're kind of running out of time, so we have a couple of minutes for questions.
I think one of the biggest problem with the AJAX one was the auto-generated hash key or like the wrapper ID that every time you add something that it just manually renders out one, right? Like there's a wrapper ID that changes and then you need to start a new one. I believe this one would solve all the bugs.
Yes, because at least in my example, so I've got an example here that does add another element. So this you can add more elements to this form, and because it goes to the back end and renders the form and then returns the entire form back, it's still got that form ID in place, hasn't it? So
and one of the problems that you have with that one is Drupal does that form updated thing when the ID changes.
Yeah.
And then now it seems like this one is just replacing the part of the HTML. I wonder how the code is solving that problem. The form ID hash, if you update part of the form, that would change. And that's not updated on a top-down level, then Drupal doesn't know like a value generated like extra render or something, you know?
Yeah.
Pumping.
In my experimentation, I haven't had to do a lot with form IDs,
Right.
or anything really. So the add another form recreates the form as it would be in the backend when you do that post request. So when I said, in the talk, try to be consistent with forms, it's about making sure that when you submit it, that you actually produce the same form in its entirety as backend.
Am I right thinking you replace the whole form, but part?
So you can replace part of the form, but as long as in the backend, if you want to reprint the form out, you print what is on the front end as well. So you sort of make the two compatible, then that should work. You should get the response back as well. So in here, all I'm doing is saying, count the number of elements I've got on the page there, and so as it's going through this list, it's generating new IDs, which means that as I submit the form, the form will contain all the elements in that form. Yeah, it won't. It's not a case of adding in things in the front end and expecting them to be somehow in the back end as well. I'm actually recreating the form in PHP as it was in the front end.
Is that rebuild? Is that form something that it does?
Yeah, so that's the rebuild.
Something the rebuild form, right?
Yeah, so when you submit the form, it builds the form and then it submits it. So you need to make sure that the build step works. In other words.
So if you're doing a worker, you should make sure rebuild true, then it will automatically.
Yeah. So then ideally, if you want to remove HTMX from the equation, you should be able to add an element to the form and have it produce the form in its entirety without necessarily relying on HTMX to do that. So remember, HTMX asks the server and you get the full form back, and then you need to pick out from that form the elements that you want to redistribute into the page. So Drupal already knows about the new form, doesn't it? Yeah. So
We are.
I'm here all day. Thanks, tomorrow.